Good afternoon. I'm Raleigh Flynn, the president of the Foreign Policy Research Institute, and welcome to our program today. We're going to be talking with our Eurasia program director, Professor Chris Miller, who's going to be talking about his new book, We Shall Be Masters, Russian Pivots to East Asia from Peter the Great to Putin. I can't think of a more appropriate topic for what's going on in the world right now. Our host today since this is in part of our People, Politics, and Prose series, our host today is going to be FPRI's Ron Granieri, who is the executive director of FPRI's Center for the Study of America and the West. And he's also a professor at the Army War College. And because of that, I have to do our obligatory disclaimer that Ron's comments here today do not necessarily reflect the opinions of the Army War College, the US Army, or the Department of Defense. I'd like to plug one of our upcoming events while I have you all, and that is Thursday afternoon from 3 to 4. We are going to have the official launch of our Africa program with a program on why Africa matters to the US. And our guests will include the former US Assistant Secretaries of State for African Affairs, Ambassador Hank Cohen and Jende Frazier. They're going to discuss Africa and why it matters to US foreign policy. And that is the official launch of our new Africa program. Before we get started, a reminder to put your questions in the Q&A box, as Ron will be going to their questions about halfway through. And before I send you off, I have to say thank you to our sponsors, our members, and our board. And to remind those of you who are not yet in one of those categories to please consider joining one of those categories. So without further ado, let me turn it over to our host today, Ron Granieri.
Thank you, Raleigh. And thank you, ladies and gentlemen, for joining us today for People, Politics, and Prose, FPRI's conversations with authors about their works, their careers, and the ideas that drive them. I am Ron Granieri, and on behalf of everybody at FPRI, I thank you for joining us on Zoom. It's a pleasure to have you with us. In Europe, we were hangers-on and slaves, while in Asia, we shall be masters. In Europe, we were Tatars, while in Asia, we are the Europeans. That quotation from a writer's diary by Fyodor Dostoevsky provides the opening epigram of Professor Chris Miller's new book, We Shall Be Masters, Russia's pivots to the East. Well, let me try that one more time, ladies and gentlemen. From Chris Miller's new book, We Shall Be Masters, Russia's pivots to the East to East Asia from Peter the Great to Putin. A sweeping survey of 5 centuries of Russian interactions with its Eastern neighbors. In chapters rich in fascinating detail, Professor Miller introduces us to the Tsar's advisors and adventurers who sought to expand Russia's horizons. Most of these efforts came to naught, as Miller concludes, quote, the only enduring feature that unites Russia's various Asian pivots is the role of excessive optimism in launching them. Rather than enduring interests, Russian foreign policy in Asia has been built on a foundation of fantasies, on dreams and delusions. That may be true, but it has not stopped the cycle of enthusiasm from starting again, seemingly in every generation, from the first expeditions to Kodiak Island to the Putin administration's current efforts at a new rapprochement with China. Perhaps this time will be different. Perhaps this time the Russians will achieve their Asian dreams. What would that mean for Russia? What would that mean for the wider world? These questions, and yours, will guide us in discussion with our guest, Professor Chris Miller. And Chris Miller is the director of FPRI's Eurasia program. He's the author of multiple works on contemporary Russia, including the books The Struggle to Save the Soviet Economy, Mikhail Gorbachev and the Collapse of the USSR, and Putinomics, Power and Money in Resurgent Russia. He is also assistant professor of international history at the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy at Tufts University, and we are delighted to have him with us today. Welcome, Chris Miller.
Well, thank you, Ron, for having me.
So, Chris, how did this book come to be, and how does it fit with your earlier work on the Gorbachev and Putin eras?
Well, my first book on the collapse of the Soviet Union tried to understand why during the 1980s, the Soviet Union, which had a centrally planned communist economic and political system, was unable to pull off what the Chinese, who also had a centrally planned political and economic system, were able to do at the exact same time, which was turn their economy into something more capable of competing in the modern world. It is part of that I discovered something that I didn't expect, which is that in addition to measuring themselves vis-a-vis Western powers in the 1980s, the Soviet Union was also comparing itself to China, which in hindsight perhaps shouldn't have been surprising, but from the perspective of an American looking at Russia, it was. And from that experience, I learned something important, which is that although Americans like to think about Russia in the context of Russia's relationship with the West, it is Russians very frequently also compare themselves primarily to the countries on their Western border. In fact, the country has a very long tradition of focusing its foreign policy, not only in Europe, but also in Asia. And as I tried to understand how this developed historically, it became clear to me that this was nothing new in the Gorbachev era in the late Soviet Union. In fact, throughout the Soviet period and even going back several centuries under the Tsars, the Russian government had repeatedly tried to find diplomatic opportunities, openings for imperial expansion in Asia and across the Pacific Ocean. And this seemed to me like something that was worth exploring, in part because so much of our understanding of Russia focuses on Russia's European diplomacy and its relations with European powers, and sets aside the, I think, quite important question of Russia's role in Asia.
Mm-hmm. You know, that quote from Dostoevsky really struck me at the beginning, because in his book, The Course of German History, A.J.P. Taylor classically also describes the Germans as having two faces, that the sort of a supplicant face that they turn to the West where they're trying to measure up, and an aggressive, even haughty face to the East, the assumption that everybody to their East is somehow beneath them. Dostoevsky, of course, famously preferred to look to Europe in some ways, but this complicated vision of, for Russians, how beyond the sort of the level of the leaders that you talk about, right? Is it fair to say that the Russians share this sort of bifurcated vision that Dostoevsky suggests, sort of wanting to emulate the Europeans, but are frustrated because the Europeans don't think they're quite up to their measure, and therefore then turning to the East and assuming, well, at least we're better than these people? Is that a common approach in Russia, do you think?
Well, I think what you find is that the use of Europe and Asia in Russian politics changes over time, and different people use the concepts of Europe and Asia to measure themselves and compare and contrast themselves differently whenever it's useful. And so I was struck by a couple of things when I looked at this 300-year chunk of Russian history. One is that the definition of what is Europe and what is Asia changes very frequently. So for example, if you were to look at the countries that were managed by the Eastern Division or the Oriental Division of the Tsarist Russian Foreign Ministry in the late 19th century, you would find that they were in charge of territories stretching from the border of the Austro-Hungarian Empire all the way to Japan. That was the East in Russian thinking, which of course doesn't correspond with the way Europe and Asia is used today. And so what struck me is that the definition of Asia and Europe was always changing based on the political requirements of the time. When Russia was having bad relations with Europe and it was worthwhile to push against the Europeans and to assert difference, then Russians redefined themselves as Eurasian or Asian in some ways. Whereas when Russian leaders wanted to improve their ties with Europe and embrace Westernization, they would describe themselves as European and assert their differences from Asia. And so rather than any sort of fundamental ability to put Russia in one category or the other, what was striking to me is the way that Russian politicians and Russian intellectuals were constantly using this as a political tool, redefining their identity to suit the politics of the age.
You know, I find that very interesting. When we talk about long periods like that, we try to draw these continuities, right? It is a historian's challenge, right? You can reach very far back, but people are always going to ask, well, how relevant is the distant past to the present, right? Do you find that there are specific reference points at various times that leaders have chosen? I especially think of this since the Soviet Union, of course, wanted to be a brand new society. And after the end of the Soviet Union, there was also a desire to sort of shake off the Soviet tradition. So there are these moments in Russian history where the Russians want to say we're starting off new, but clearly history is still something they're carrying around with them. And so how conscious are these continuities over time?
Well, I think they're quite conscious, and you can find on a regular basis Russians referencing back to Peter the Great or even earlier, either as a way of embracing that legacy or as a way of rejecting it. And what was striking to me is not only that you have this conscious adoption or rejection of history repeatedly taking place, but also that geography forces you to deal with these questions in certain ways. The fact that Russian foreign policy is taking place in the same territory over several hundred years is really important. So the places that Peter the Great was fighting his wars are more or less the same places that Russia was fighting Napoleon, which are more or less the same places that Stalin was fighting Hitler. And the fact that the geography is only little changed over time meant that it was almost impossible to avoid thinking about one's predecessors when they were fighting or contesting the same territory. And so although you've got these choices you can make about which political figures you embrace and which you reject, the geographic realities mean that some of the questions, at least, are constantly posed to Russian leaders. You just can't ignore them.
Right. Well, I guess that's, here at FPRI, we talk a lot about the problem of geopolitics, the persistence of geography, the importance of history and culture. But connected to that, the assumption, and this is a question that I see Jacqueline Reich is already, she's written something that I was thinking about too to ask you, and that is the title and the attitude behind the Dostoevsky phrase is an assumption of Russian superiority over the Asians, which you would think that might drive certain behavior, but also would create stumbling blocks in the sense that it's probably not surprising that that they're not able to find Asian partners if they treat the Asians as somewhat below them. And so should we understand the failure of previous Russian efforts in Asia to be a sort of inevitable function of these assumptions of ethnocentric superiority?
I think that's certainly been a problem at different times. What's striking to me is the way that you often have at the same time a sense of superiority combined with a sense of duty, and even at times a sense of asserted equality. So for example, if you look back to the early days of the Bolshevik Revolution in the 1920s, when the Soviet Union turned towards China and tried to spread the power of communism in China, what's striking is on the one hand, the ideology was very much an ideology of equality, asserting the equality of all peoples, both between countries and within them in the most radical version possible. On the other hand, the definition of who was in charge of interpreting and articulating this ideology was very clear. It was Moscow that was in charge, and the Chinese were the recipients. And so I've been struck by the extent to which, on the one hand, you've got this assertion of superiority, but it's often coupled in very unexpected ways with claims for equality or claims that Russia is at least looking out for countries on its Asian frontier. At some points, even protecting them from other great powers. And on the one hand, it's easy as a historian to treat these claims as being quite cynical, and in some ways they probably were, but I think they were actually effective in Russian politics because they were often believed by other Russians. It was possible both to simultaneously believe that you were superior and that you were doing some sort of moral service to your neighbors by, quote unquote, protecting them from other less attractive rivals.
Well, and then that raises the question of the flip side today, and that is to say the way the Chinese view the Russians today. How do the Chinese and the Russians balance their let's say their competing sense of their historical narratives? Because the Chinese, of course, have a historical narrative that they're coming back after a century of oppression, and it comes from a sense of the natural superiority that they're finally able to assert. And is this a way for the Russians and the Chinese to understand each other, or is this a barrier to their understanding of each other?
I think barrier is more likely. If you read Chinese narratives about the century of oppression they're coming back from, the primary oppressors were the British and the Americans, but the Russians weren't that far behind, having seized a fair chunk of Chinese territory to the north of the country over the course of the 19th century, and then again in the 20th century, meddling in a whole variety of different ways in Chinese politics. It's easy for Chinese to tell a narrative of victimization on the hands of Russia too. I think what's striking when you look at the political leaders in both Beijing and in Moscow is the extent to which they have very decisively tried to put historical questions to the side. They don't want to talk about them for understandable reasons. And they've done a good job, in part because both control their media landscape pretty effectively, of keeping discussion of these issues out of the center of discussion. And so in Russian media, it's not nearly as common as one might think to have these issues formally aired. What you do find, though, is outside of the officially controlled media and outside of government narratives in Russia and in China, popular views are often quite different. And especially, I think, popular views in the areas that are closest to the border. There's a lot of skepticism that you find on the Russian blogosphere and in local media about Chinese investment, for example, in the Russian Far East. And I think anecdotally the same is true on the Chinese side of the border. So you've got different views from the government officials in Moscow and Beijing, from people on the ground who are closer to the border and closer to the interaction between the two countries.
And so this is one advantage, as you say, if both states have a great deal of control over their media, the Russians don't have to fear that on some television program, some highly placed Russian is going to go off about the historical Russian mission to civilize and control East Asia in a way that's going to scotch any particular deal with the Chinese. But how in practice, and I want to come back to the historical questions a bit, but the contemporary issue is interesting here. In practice, do these, the existence of these cynicisms or these skepticisms along the border on the ground, do they get in the way much at all these days? Or is the relationship relatively stable at the official level, and that's good enough?
I think it's more the latter. If you look at how decision-making on foreign policy is made both in Russia and in China, there's not a lot of cases where local complaints play a major role in the articulation of foreign policy. If you take Russia, for example, the way the political system is structured is to ignore local political questions, except when they lead to some sort of mass protest that must be addressed. But the preference is to not listen to the provinces. And in Russia and in China, the places on the two countries' border are the most ignored of all the provinces in both countries. So there's very little obvious way that locals can directly impact the relationship. But what I do think is important to note is that both countries have needed to manage not only their local populaces along the border, but also their own political elite. Because although there's consensus in both countries' leaderships that the relationship is important to both, they want to keep it on track, it's also the case, and you see this not infrequently with Russian officials, that pre-existing conceptions about the relationship and fears about the future direction occasionally come out in the public view in a way that I don't think is planned. I think is deviations from the party line, when people kind of stray away from their officially determined talking points. And there you see this concern that is always right behind the official line. And I think this is evidence not that either country is at any point going to overturn the status quo in the relationship or return to a much more competitive relationship, but rather that there are these deeper historical legacies that remain relevant. And if conditions change, it wouldn't be very hard to imagine either side drawing on these existing views to rapidly refashion its policy. So not a prediction of what's going to happen in the future, but a reminder that these things can change pretty quickly. And the good relations today are no guarantee that we're going to have good relations in a decade's time.
Right. Now, unfortunately, the past may be prologue, but it's a past performance is no guarantee of future returns. But there is an interesting paradox here, and Jerry Rubinstein has a question about the Russian economy, which is built largely on exporting energy, which would seem to be the opposite of the Chinese economy, but also could create complementarities. But I also think, and there's a paradox here, is that Russian expansion into the Far East that you describe in the earlier centuries was the Russians looking for resources. And now it is the Russians who have the basic resources, and they're trying to use the hydrocarbons in particular as a way to leverage their relations with the East. This is it is an interesting paradox of the traditional relationship between the advanced economy on the one side and the extractive economy on the other. And how does this influence the political relations or the way that deals are struck between the Chinese and the Russians today?
But if you look historically, one of the challenges that Russia has consistently faced over the past 3 centuries is you've got this territory in Siberia in the Far East. How do you make it economically viable? And this has been extraordinarily difficult to do, to the extent that I think it's fair to say that the Russian Far East has never really been economically viable. It's always relied on really substantial subsidies from Moscow in the center of Russia to fund the daily life and to fund the Russian state's existence on the frontier, to garrison the military, to build the infrastructure. That hasn't changed. There are still special Russian government programs to subsidize living standards in the Far East. It's still the case that the cost of living in the Far East is substantially higher than in the center of Russia. It's still the case that wages are substantially lower than the central of Russia. So this economic problem is less acute than it was, say, 2 decades ago, but in no means has it gone away. And we've seen a massive emigration out of the Far East of Russia towards Moscow and southern Russia over the past couple of decades. A substantial percentage of the population has simply picked up and left. And so that makes this question of how do you actually make the Far East economically viable really important. And that's where resources come into play. However, what's challenging for the Russian government today is that although China is a voracious consumer of resources and Russia has benefited immensely from this, as China has driven up global commodity prices by consuming lots of oil and gas and minerals and the other commodities that Russia produces, China, for most of these commodities, has many options from which to buy. When you look at oil, China buys from all of the major producers in the Middle East, as well as from further afield. Gas as well. China imports liquefied natural gas from a variety of different countries. It has gas pipelines from multiple different countries, including former republics of the Soviet Union, now in Central Asia. And so Russia is, for most of the commodities in question, a price taker. China's got the diversified supply, and so Russia doesn't have that much leverage over China as one might think. And I think there's an important difference with Europe here. There's a number of European countries that, as is often debated in the media, are really quite reliant on Russia as a primary supplier of gas. In some cases, 80 or 90% of the gas comes from Russia. China's not like that. Russia's a relatively small supplier of gas for China, and China's got a lot of flexibility to move between different suppliers. And so in addition to having very little pricing power over China, Russia has very little, if any, political leverage over China, given the fact that it's supplying. And so in that sense, I think China is really substantially benefiting substantially more from this relationship, because it's getting lots of commodities, it's getting a very secure supply at a price that it has a better capacity to negotiate. But I think there's a complementarity here, as you flagged, Ron, which is that China needs the commodities, Russia is willing to sell them. And so I often read analyses suggesting that China needs to gobble up Russian territory in order to get access to the commodities. And that seems to misunderstand completely Russia's bargaining power. Russia has no choice but to sell its commodities to China. So what's the point of gobbling up Russian territory when you can already get all the commodities you want easily on offer?
Why colonize the cow when you can get the milk for free, or something along those lines?
Right.
But well, then that does kind of turn on its head the idea that the Russians will be masters in their relationships with Asia as well. Let me push, because you mentioned two things that struck me as well here about the eastern provinces of Russia have generally been the most neglected, but there's also the issue of the former Soviet republics of Central Asia, and what role do they play in Russia's current visions for Asia? Because one does get the impression that, for example, the Chinese imagine those republics as important way stations on the Belt and Road Initiative. But how do the Russians imagine their relations with Central Asia as part of a larger Asian strategy?
Well, it's certainly the case that China sees the countries of Central Asia as being fairly important for the Belt and Road, and it's not a coincidence that Xi Jinping announced the Belt and Road almost a decade ago in the capital of Kazakhstan. So the Belt and Road has been at the core of the Chinese agenda in Central Asia for some time. But for Russia, I think the Russian government has, over the past 25 years, substantially downgraded the importance of Central Asia in its thinking. Central Asia is still a territory that Russians see as being, to a certain extent, in their backyard, but it doesn't seem nearly as important as it used to, in large part because there's only a small number of meaningful businesses in Central Asia. The gas, for example, in Turkmenistan, or the oil and gas in Kazakhstan, and this is already monopolized by the local elites. So there's not a whole lot of money to be made in Central Asia. And beyond that, many Central Asians themselves have moved to Russia. There's millions of Central Asian migrant workers in Russia. And so the Russian government doesn't think there's a whole lot of purpose in focusing its foreign policy on Central Asia. There's just no benefit from spending your scarce time or political capital in the region. And so that explains, I think, why the Russians have been, in some ways, surprisingly tolerant of China's expanding influence in the area, expanding its economic presence, expanding its footprint in terms of infrastructure, playing an ever bigger role in building out surveillance technology in Central Asia with the support of local governments. And all of this Russia has seen as being largely non-problematic, which might seem surprising from the perspective of the history. But when you look at how Russia prioritizes its relationships today, Central Asia is just at the bottom of the list. Far more important is Europe and the former Soviet states in Europe, China, India, other big players in Eurasia. And the Central Asian countries really aren't seen as being that high of a priority.
That's interesting. I wouldn't have thought that way, considering how jealously Russia talks about guarding its near abroad. That it could be so casual about the loss of what were formerly constituent parts of the Soviet Union. Well, let's flip from looking down to the south and the east to looking to the north. I've got several questions here about the Arctic and how certainly climate change has opened up new opportunities in the Arctic, which would offer Russia a chance to really play a major role geopolitically in that region. But we also know that the Chinese are talking about themselves as a near Arctic power, which is a nice turn of phrase. I suppose here in Philadelphia, we are a near Arctic location as well. But it doesn't feel that way in June. But in what way will the opening up of the Arctic, which is an area of opportunity for Russia, is that also an area that could complicate their relations with their eastern neighbors? I think about this too, because some of the best parts of the early sections of your book is talking about these Russian settlements in the Aleutian Islands and in Kamchatka and in these places where it's freezing cold all the time and everybody's dropping dead of scurvy. We don't have those problems today. I imagine they would have liked to have had a better passage through the Arctic in the 17th and 18th century. So where does that fit into this larger narrative?
Well, it's great to put it in a historical perspective. And I think one of the dilemmas that Russia has always faced in its expansion towards its eastern territories is that the rivers in Siberia all run north to south. So they all let out into the sea in the Arctic and are inaccessible by ship and surrounded by inhospitable lands, unlike east-west rivers, which is what you want if you're in Russia. And I think this is why, dating all the way back to Peter, there were dreams of, could you get a regular means of sailing through the Arctic Ocean in a way that would facilitate commerce and facilitate the deployment of military power in the Pacific? And this was never possible, and to the day still hasn't really been possible in any sort of meaningful way. But perhaps many Russians think the melting of Arctic sea ice might make this more plausible. And I think there's not much doubt that if the melting of sea ice continues along current projections, it will be possible at some point later this century to, on a regular basis, sail commercial vessels through the Arctic. I think the question is, does it matter? And here it's not at all obvious that it does. It's the case that today, most trade from China to Europe, which sails through the Indian Ocean, up the Suez Canal to the Mediterranean, passes by Sudan on the way to the Suez Canal. It's not obvious that Sudan gets any sort of great economic or geopolitical benefits from this. And the way that seaborne trade works is that it goes by sea. It doesn't stop at ports along the way. And so it seems implausible to me that Russia, whose cities are 1,000 miles south of the Arctic Ocean, with only a couple of exceptions, is going to extract any sort of great economic or political benefit by the fact that far offshore, there are container ships sailing by, almost certainly in most cases not stopping to refuel or drop off any sort of shipments at Russian ports because there's no one living in the Arctic. And so you'd be about as close in Moscow to the Arctic Ocean routes as Sudan is to the Red Sea. And I think the benefits that you get are roughly comparable. Now, you might see in response, well, perhaps if this is going through Russian territorial waters, Russia could cut off transit through the Arctic Ocean. I think that's a a real plausible statement. But it's also the case that there are other routes to send goods from Asia to Europe, such as the routes we already use today. And if Russia wanted to begin cutting off shipping routes to the Arctic Ocean, the cost of transporting goods would increase slightly, but only to today's level. And so the thesis would provide some sort of extraordinary geopolitical benefit to anyone in Moscow seems to me pretty implausible. And so I follow the Russian debate, and I just scratch my head wondering what's the mechanism by which this is going to provide great benefits.
I mean, I'm delighted that you phrased it in this way, because it is a fascinating point, because people talk about it, they say it, and certainly you've read them, I've read them, especially here in the United States, where people talk about this is a great opportunity for Russia, and everybody nods sagely without ever really saying what that opportunity is going to be. It's not as though Archangel and Murmansk are going to become the new Singapore or anything like that. And yet, so what is the Russian, when the Russians talk about the Arctic, do they are they talking about it in the same superficial terms, or of, we have a huge Arctic coastline, stuff going through the Arctic, profit, right? Is that just sort of the way that they're looking at it too?
I think there are some better arguments than the one we hear most about the sea lanes. One argument is about offshore mineral wealth. Drilling offshore, which will become easier as ice melts. It's plausible there's something to that. Although I think what we know thus far is that the minerals that are most likely to be offshore are gas in particular. And if just projecting forward current energy trends, it seems implausible to me that we'll be demanding a lot more gas in the middle of the century if, in fact, Europe begins to decarbonize its economy and we move to more sustainable energy. So I'm a bit skeptical of whether that's going to be all that it seems to be. There's also a lot of discussion in Russia of the benefits to the territory of northern Russia as temperatures rise and become more hospitable, agriculture improves. It's certainly plausible. I think I put a pretty high confidence interval on our ability to assess what the effects of agriculture will be as temperatures warm. Perhaps there are some benefits there, but when you look at agriculture today, it's a couple percentage points of Russian GDP. So even if it doubles in importance, this isn't anything particularly revolutionary. So as a result, I think there's, on the economic side, I think what is relevant is on the military side, and this is where the Russian government has also been focusing. If you buy the thesis that there's more shipping that's going to be flowing through Arctic waters, and if you buy the thesis that every other country that borders the Arctic will be focusing more on the region simply because there's more activity there, then suddenly the Arctic becomes a space less of cooperation and more competition. And you've seen the Russian military reinforce its facilities in the Arctic. And I think that is something that the Russian government is definitely focused on as well. Not the positive benefits, but the negative benefits. And here the question is not really China in Russian thinking. It's NATO, it's the Arctic states. Norway, Canada, Denmark, and above all, the United States.
Because the idea that for military purposes, being able to transit the Arctic would finally allow the Russians to escape the encirclement that they see coming from Norway, Canada, and whatnot. Interesting point. But then we're back to that same idea if we're talking about economics, right? Is if the Russians use that power to control that sea lane, then people will just go back to avoiding it. And if it's one thing, if it's blocked by ice or blocked by the Russian Navy, it's blocked and you don't go there. Well, let me. There are two big questions. I'm going to hit one first, and we'll see if we can go back to the other one. And that is, you started your research, and you mentioned at the beginning here, saying that you were interested in the question of why didn't Russia manage to do what the Chinese did after 1989? Why didn't they?
I think
I realize this is where you could say see my published works, but I see if you can give me a short answer for our purposes today.
No, it's a fundamental question for understanding the history of the 20th century and the modern world. So I think it's worth discussing. I think there are two reasons why. First is that the Russians already did what the Chinese have just finished doing in the middle of the 20th century, which is to say that the great accomplishment of the Chinese Communist Party over the past 40 years has been to take hundreds of millions of peasants off their farms and put them in basic factory jobs. And that was profoundly transformative for China. It drastically raised living standards across China, but it's something that happened in the United States and Western Europe in the early part of the 20th century, and it's something that happened in Russia in the middle part of the 20th century. That's what Stalin's industrialization did. So answer one is that China was starting already far behind, and so it was just catching up to where Russia is. And depending on what metric you use, Russian wages are today roughly comparable with Chinese wages, depending on your conversion factor. So China has caught up arguably, but it certainly hasn't surged ahead in any sort of meaningful metric. The second argument, I think, relates to the way the communist parties in both countries functioned. In the Soviet Union, the Communist Party was a chaotic institution under Stalin because Stalin was constantly shaking it up by purging all of his middle managers. Tens and tens of thousands of middle managers were sent to the Gulag or killed under Stalin on a fairly regular basis. And there were many downsides of that, but one of the rare upsides was that it kept all of the officials on their toes because the punishment was not simply professional humiliation or a slow promotion, it was death. So that's a pretty good incentive to make sure you're doing a good job. Under Khrushchev and under Brezhnev, the Soviet government started using less effective incentives. It stopped punishing people nearly as violently. It closed down the gulags. And so officials spent more time focusing on their own careers and focusing on their own incomes rather than achieving central government goals. They became less effective as bureaucrats. And I don't endorse this as a strategy for providing better incentives for government bureaucrats, but I think it's worth noting that for all of the bloodshed under Stalin, it did have this side effect of making sure that the bureaucrats were following their orders. China had a different setup in the 1980s. Unlike the Soviet Union, which had this sclerotic bureaucracy that had solidified under the Brezhnev period, China in 1980 had just been shaken up by the Cultural Revolution. There were no bureaucratic factors at play in China because everyone had just been reshuffled around the entire country. Bureaucracies had been turned upside down. Elite groups had been broken up by the Cultural Revolution. People had been sent from the cities to work on peasant farms in the countryside. And so there were no interest groups or no lobby groups in the Chinese Communist Party that remained because they'd all been subjected to the most revolutionary movements of the 20th century saw. And so that provided a blank slate of sorts on which Deng Xiaoping could draw up his new version of the Chinese Communist Party. And I think to his credit, if you start with his goals, Deng Xiaoping was a very effective designer of Communist Party 2.0 in China, even though it's got to be admitted that he had a pretty good starting point. This blank slate coupled with a complete repudiation of what Mao had created, given how disastrous the Chinese Communist Party's governance was during the Cultural Revolution. But I think these two factors are really crucial in understanding why the fate of Deng was really shaped by the much more favorable political situation he inherited in contrast to Gorbachev, who inherited the world's most bureaucratic bureaucracy, a system where no one lived well, but everyone lived well enough that they didn't want to gamble everything on any sort of radical change.
This is a fascinating question because it also gets the idea of, where and anywhere in this discussion is communism as an ideology, right? Because if we're talking about how Deng managed to hold on to, they still call themselves the Communist Party, but whether they're particularly communist or not, is open to question. Whereas, of course, in the Soviet Union, there was no, after 1990, 1991, it became virtually a given that they were not going to make reference to communist ideology, at least in the governing of the state. And yet, right, the current Russian regime does look to the Soviet Union for certain models of governance and international behavior, even if they don't use communism. And so what role can or should the mutual communist past play in shaping the future relationship between Russia and East Asian states like the People's Republic, but also like North Korea or North Vietnam that also share that communist past?
I think it's hard to find direct ways that the legacy of Marxism-Leninism solidifies the relationship between Russia and China today. In Russia, it's true, as you say, that there's often desire to look to the Soviet past, but the Soviet past to which the Russian government looks has nothing to do with Marxism-Leninism. They reject Lenin as a dangerous revolutionary and instead embrace Stalin, who himself was a Marxist-Leninist, but who's also a great practitioner of great power politics in the classic Russian mold. And that's the way in which Russia's leaders today embrace the Soviet past. Ideology is seen as an error in Soviet history. And many Russians today express the view that if only the Soviet Union hadn't had the ideology, it would have done a better job at great power politics. And there's probably something to that argument. In China, this question is complicated further by the fact that, as you say, whatever the Chinese mean by Marxism, Leninism, Mao Zedong thought today, it doesn't look all that much like what Lenin meant by it. It's hard to see the similarities beyond the citation to the same texts and the condemnation of the West. And I think that final point really is the only thing the only glue from the communist era that still unites Russia and China, which is this shared history of opposition to the West, which provides both in Russia and in China plenty of ideological ammunition to draw on as they both formulate their foreign policies in opposition to the United States. And in both countries, because of this past of conflict with the United States and with the West in general, it's relatively easy today to build political coalitions internally for continued struggle against the West.
Well, and that opens the door to another question I wanted to ask you, and that is, what, if anything, can or should, since we know that President Biden and his colleagues sitting in Cornwall earlier this week and going forward, right, they're talking about how to deal with China, how to deal with Russia. Is there anything that the West can or should do in order to I won't say to break up partnership between Russia and China, because that might be too much, but what could they do to encourage the Russians, for example, to see their future lying in cooperation with the West rather than cooperation with China?
I don't know that there's a whole lot realistically that the US can do. The reason that Russia and China are getting along so well right now is primarily because both of them see the US as their primary rival. And they're not wrong to see that. That's just an objective statement of fact. And there's not a lot that any US government under Biden or any other president is going to realistically do to change that fact. One could conceive of policies that would reduce tensions with Russia, reduce tensions in policy. But I think when you consider the gamut of politically realistic Russia and China policies, the basic confrontation, I don't think, is going to change, even if it ebbs and flows over time. And so when I hear people speculate about we should do this or that to break apart Russia and China, I really wonder to what extent any of this is either A, politically feasible in the US, I think a lot of it is not, or B, would actually impact Russian and Chinese decision-making. Because given the current balance of forces and given the preferences of the United States relative to the goals of Russia and China, it's not wrong to say that there are a whole lot of conflicting interests and conflicting goals between the US and Russia and the US and China. And given their relative weakness vis-a-vis the United States, it's somewhat natural that they would be cooperating together against the United States.
Let me flip that question a little bit and say this. Is there a way one could imagine that Russia and China, if they managed their relationship with each other and their approach to the rest of the world, that they would be able, say, to encourage the Europeans to could they pry the Europeans away from the United States and into a kind of Halford Mackinder's great dream of a single world, Eurasian world island cooperative sphere?
Well, I like to think back to 2003 in the run-up to the Iraq War, when Vladimir Putin, a young Russian president, and the Chancellor of Germany and the President of France at the time were standing together at the same podium, condemning the United States for being unilateral and invading Iraq. And it seems to me that the failure of Russia to keep together that coalition was the most egregious failure of any country's foreign policy in the 21st century. It ought to have been not that hard to keep that coalition together. And instead, Russia did everything one would do to break it apart and push the Europeans closer to the United States. And so it seems to me that one of the factors that keeps NATO relevant and keeps Russia and Europe apart is the way Russia interacts with its European neighbors. It just seems to be unable to help but angering and threatening the Europeans on a regular basis. And even the French, who have been historically inclined for the last 50 years to repeatedly try to move closer to Moscow. Every time they try a new reset of their relationship and invoke the ghost of Charles de Gaulle, Russia does something new that torpedoes the French efforts. And so we've seen that with Macron recently. He wants a reset with Russia, right, and the Russians just won't give him an 18-month period without any provocations that would make it possible.
Just can't help themselves. I'm reminded, you mentioned de Gaulle's famous statement when he flew to Moscow in 1966, and he said, "Eternal France greets eternal Russia." So the idea that you'll put aside ideology, right, that there's something that pulls us together. And yet Russia and France have this larger struggle of, if the Russians simply cannot imagine making the compromises necessary to improve their relations with their Western neighbors. That is an ongoing challenge. Well, and this leads to a question that one attendee has sent in about Russia and China's approach to third states. In other words, that they may not be coordinating their policy very well because they end up approaching things differently, right? Russia's relationship with Iran is different than China's relationship with Iran. The Russians might encourage the Iranians to provoke the Americans, whereas the Chinese just want to keep the oil flowing, and they would rather that the Iranians didn't. Is there any, do you have any insights into how well Russia and China are working to coordinate or harmonize their approach to other regions? The Middle East, for example, is the biggest one that I have in mind.
It doesn't seem like there's a lot of evidence that the Russians and the Chinese are devoting a whole lot of attention to coordinating their policies. I think there's a lot of ways in which they naturally agree, and so they pursue policies that align with each other, but we haven't seen, for example, many places where one side will take a step that is not in its interests for the sake of the other, or try to create an opening for the other to step in. That hasn't been the case. I think in 95% of the cases, if not more, where we see Russia and China on the same page, advocating the same outcome, it's because they already were on the same page and advocated the same outcome. You don't see anything like you see between the US and Europe, or US and some Asian allies, of joint planning of positions, of trying to devise a collective policy process. The relationship is much more ad hoc. And in the Russian debate as well as in the Chinese debate, you've seen the question of whether the relationship is a, quote, alliance broached a number of times. And Putin himself has at least once used that phrase, but sort of questioning whether it was an alliance, not stating it was an alliance. And I think this is a meaningful distinction. Both countries are very aware, because they strongly oppose US alliances with Japan, with South Korea, with European countries. They know what an alliance is, and they have been very careful to not label the relationship an alliance. Even as they said it's getting closer and closer and closer, it's still not that, because both countries wants to retain its own room for maneuver and doesn't want to be bound by the other's foreign policy.
And that is a long-term problem, I guess, in any relationship. Well, and what about the personalities involved? Ambassador Adrian Basora has a question about especially Xi Jinping's increasingly We know what Vladimir Putin likes to present himself as a strong man. Is how well are the personal dynamics of the leaders either encouraging or discouraging Russo-Chinese cooperation?
Well, all the evidence that we have is that the two leaders get along well. Whether that's true in practice, we know that they both made substantial efforts to make it seem as though they get along very well, which is perhaps the part that really matters. Vladimir Putin has described Xi Jinping as his best friend. Xi Jinping 2 years ago got Putin his favorite ice cream on his birthday. So they're playing buddy-buddy to the extent that no other Russian and Chinese leader ever has. Even in the days of Mao and Stalin, Stalin repeatedly abused Mao and humiliated him. And when Khrushchev succeeded Mao, Mao liked to humiliate Khrushchev in response. There's none of that in the current Russian-Chinese relationship. No humiliation whatsoever. It's nothing but friendship. And I think from the perspective of the relationship in general, the Chinese deserve a fair amount of credit for having handled the relationship very successfully, because the key dilemma for the Russians is that they were always very happy to be the big brother in a relationship with China. And today, everyone except for them sees themselves as the little brother in the relationship. And even in Russia, there's a sort of nagging recognition that, in fact, China is growing substantially in influence, while Russia's position is much less obviously growing. and China relative to Russia has become substantially more powerful. And yet the Chinese have been very, very careful and very, very successful in not making any Russians feel this personally. And all of the pageantry, all of the organization of the summits between Putin and Xi is designed to create a relationship that looks and feels to the Russians like a relationship of equals. And I think that's very important to Putin.
Right. Well, and that is, so that is a certain triumph, we could say, of Chinese diplomacy up to a point, right? That they are not reminding the Russians of the imbalance. But here's the imbalance question as well with Putin's relationship to the Europeans, right? Your historical narrative emphasizes that the Russian regimes have tended to turn east when they have felt blocked in the West. And so now there is a little bit of that, but the Russians are at the same time both trying to break out of their blockage in the West and move into the East. But what is it? Is it possible to imagine that the Europeans might decide that China is where the action is, that Russia is a source of continuous trouble, and that they may that the Europeans might seek some kind of accommodation with the Chinese over or around the Russians? Or do the Russians see themselves as if the EU and China come together, Russia is inevitably going to be a part of it?
I think that the Russian view of all of these questions is reflected through the prism of Russian-US relations.
Uh-huh. Mm-hmm.
If you start with the Russian view of global order and the way this is taught in Russian universities, there are three great powers in the world. There's the Chinese, the Russians, the Americans, and everyone else fits into someone else's system. The Europeans today are in the American system in some sort of regime of semi-autonomy. And it's not to endorse the view, but this is how it is regularly presented in Russia. And so it seems to me that if you were to envision Europe being drawn out of its alliance with the US and cutting more deals at a higher level with China, the Russians would see that as a good piece of news, because it would mean that US-EU ties were becoming less tight, and the US was less able to pressure the US the US was less able to pressure the EU to be tough on China. And insofar as that would weaken the US, Russia would see that as a win for Russian diplomacy, because that's ultimately the overriding Russian goal when it comes to foreign policy, weaken the US vis-a-vis Russia. And so I don't think the Russians would worry at all about improving EU-China ties, because that would make the world, that would weaken the US in Russia's view, and thereby make Russia better off.
Interesting. I hadn't thought of it that way. That's a very good point. Well, because so much time has been spent talking about the role of Nord Stream 2 in binding Russia to the EU, and the United States has been sort of torn between wanting to demand that the Europeans cut off this pipeline. But if the United States demands something and doesn't get it, that weakens the American position. And so does the recent decision by the Biden administration to essentially shrug its shoulders and accept the fait accompli that is Nord Stream 2. What does this mean for American relations, U.S. relations with Russia, the triangular relationship of the U.S., EU, and Russia? And where does it fit into this larger sort of Russian view? Is this a victory in the West that the Russians will be able to build on in improving their relations with the West?
Yeah, it's a really complicated question, Ron, because I think we need to distinguish the specifics of the Nord Stream pipeline from the broader question of U.S.-Russia relations. Sure. I think the U.S. made an error over the past 5 years in thinking that Nord Stream 2 matters, because the honest answer is it doesn't, or at least as a pipeline itself, it doesn't matter. Mm-hmm. So today, Europe gets a big amount of gas from Russia. Some comes via Belarus, some comes via Ukraine, some comes via the existing Nord Stream 1 pipeline. When Nord Stream 2 is online, Europe will get more or less the same amount of gas from Russia, just more will transit through the Nord Stream 2 pipeline, less will transit through Ukraine. 10 years ago, this would have mattered a lot because there were very few interconnections between different countries' gas markets. Mm-hmm. So you could only get your gas, with some exceptions, but generally speaking, you only get your gas from the pipeline that delivered it to you. Now, there are lots of interconnections between Germany and the Czech Republic, between Czech Republic and Slovakia, between Slovakia and Ukraine, such that today Ukraine consumes only Russian gas, but it consumes Russian gas that is purchased from EU countries, which in turn purchased it from Russia. So today, Ukraine is at very little risk of a gas cutoff because it buys all of its gas from the EU, even though these gas molecules come initially from Russia. So the energy security risks to the EU from Nord Stream 2 are less than the energy security risks posed by Nord Stream 1, in part because Europe, with a lot of US pressure, has invested a lot in infrastructure that makes energy more secure. So actually, Nord Stream 2 is a silly political issue that doesn't matter. Even though it was a bad idea for Germany to embrace it, even though Germany has been lying when it says that it's a commercial issue rather than a political issue, obviously it's not, because Merkel talks about it on a regular basis. Nevertheless, it doesn't matter. However, we and the Germans and the Poles and all of our other friends in Europe have been debating it for 5 years. And so now it matters because it's being debated. And it's been a test of power and a test of strategy over something that ultimately is irrelevant, but nevertheless, it's seen as an important signal. And I think the decision about Nord Stream 2 is important, primarily because of the signal it says about Biden's priorities in Europe and about Biden's priorities vis-a-vis Russia. Mm-hmm. And I want to focus on both of those. In Europe, the Biden administration has emphasized the way that the decision not to impose fatal sanctions on Nord Stream 2 will improve relations with Germany. And that's arguably true. We could discuss that, and it depends on which parties win in the next German election. It's also true that it will be seen in Central and Eastern Europe as a betrayal and as being soft on Russia. And so the Biden administration has made clear that it's going to preference relations with Germany and with the CDU in particular over relations with Poland and the Baltic states and other countries in Central and Eastern Europe. Now, it's not obvious to me that that's the right preference to make, especially given that there's not much commercial logic to building Nord Stream 2 in the first place. Mm-hmm. But that's a choice the Biden administration has made. The second signal that's sent by Nord Stream 2 is that the Biden administration is not going to take steps on Russia that would be seen by Western Europeans, and the Germans above all, as being disruptive. And when we look at the sanctions that the Biden administration has put in place thus far, and we look at their Russia policy in aggregate, it seems to me that they've been surprisingly soft, especially considering how tough Biden's rhetoric has been. And I do think there's a sense that, in contrast to Teddy Roosevelt, who spoke about carrying a big stick, the Biden administration has actually done the opposite. It's spoken quite loudly, President Biden calling President Putin a killer, but in reality, the stick it's been carrying has been quite small. And so I worry that Nord Stream 2 and the decision about it is part of a broader pattern of missing opportunities to build leverage on the Russians and hoping that one summit is going to be enough to pressure the Russians into changing their behavior. And I don't see the historical track record that suggests that this strategy is going to pay off.
Interesting. Well, we are just about out of time, but we have a question that Walter McDougall asks, and that is lurking in the background here too. And that is from Russia's perspective. If the Europeans are reluctant to get into any conflicts with China, if there's in this growing tension between the United States and China, does Putin see an opportunity here either to cast his lot with the Chinese and thereby undermine the Americans more, or does he see a chance to essentially get along with the Europeans as a way to sort of, if the Americans and the Chinese are going to be if they're going to be fighting with each other, that Russia has more to gain by improving its relations with the Europeans?
I think everyone I've spoken with in Russia sees opportunity in more U.S.-China conflict. There's a lot of risk in that it creates huge dislocations in the international system, and in addition, it increases the risk of a great power war. Both of those would be bad for Russia. But if it's just U.S.-China competition that remains below the threshold of conflict, Russia has more room for maneuver. And so just in general, I think that's how a lot of Russian foreign policymakers see the U.S.-China competition. But as for the role of Europe in that, I think the Russians repeatedly talk about trying to improve their relations with Europe, but have shown historically they have no idea how to do it. And this is something that's been true for some time and has been demonstrated again in recent years. There just isn't the capacity in the Russian security services to allow the types of policies that would make this plausible. And the opposite is true. In fact, the Russian security services repeatedly undertake the type of policies that are perfectly designed to anger and frighten Europeans. And so whatever happens with US-China relations, I think it would be difficult to see a real improvement in Russian relations with Europe, simply because the way Russia undertakes politics is almost perfectly designed to push off the Europeans.
They just can't help themselves. Well, Chris Miller, this has been a fascinating conversation. I'm afraid that our hour is up, but we want to really thank you for joining us. Once again, we've talked a lot about contemporary events, but if you want this broad historical sweep with lots of fascinating detail and some terrific stories. I strongly encourage everyone out there to get themselves a copy of We Shall Be Masters, Russia's Pivots to East Asia, from Peter the Great to Putin, from Harvard University Press. Chris Miller, thank you for joining us today to talk about it here on People, Politics, and Prose.
Thanks so much, Ron.
And thanks for all of you for joining us today. It is important that you join us for these conversations, but today's conversation is just the beginning. The world goes on, and we will always be here to discuss it at FPRI. If you've enjoyed our conversation today, I please ask you to tell a friend and bring a friend next time as we gather to analyze our complex world. To keep up with future episodes of People, Politics, and Prose and other events at FPRI, please visit our website, fpri.org, like us on Facebook, or follow us on Twitter. You can follow the host of this program on Twitter at Ronald Granieri. We ask you to consider becoming a member or partner of FPRI in order to help us to come up with these programs. We look forward to welcoming you to future discussions. And until next time, for all of us at FPRI, I'm Ron Granieri. Thanks for joining us.